Passchendaele, officially known as the Third Battle of Ypres, was a large-scale attack against the German front line around Ypres, Belgium, during World War I. The Allies' aim was to advance into Belgium and free the German-held ports on the Belgian coast, which the Germans had been using to attack British shipping. The biggest challenge was to break through the defensive positions taken by the Germans on the West Flanders Ridge. Key to the breakthrough was seizing the village of Passchendaele. Preparations for the battle began on the 7th of June, 1917, with a heavy two-week bombardment of German positions. The Infantry Offensive began on the 31st of July, 1917. Within days, the Allied forces were stuck in mud as torrential rain turned the area into a quagmire. By the time the Allies, made up of British, French, Canadian, and Australian troops, captured Passchendaele on the 6th of November, the village was in ruins. The conflict cost 300,000 Allied lives, with a gain of 8 kilometers, 5 miles, while the Germans lost 260,000 of their troops. It was hailed as a victory by the British government, but became a byword for the utter futility of war. Two main disputes led to World War I, one between Germany and France, and the other between Russia and Austria-Hungary. The long history of mutual antipathy between Germany and France came to a head in 1870 with France's humiliating defeat by Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, which led to the annexation of most of the French provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. In Eastern Europe, the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires had a long-standing dispute over which of them had the strongest claim to power in the Balkans. Both depended on the area for access to the Mediterranean, and each eyed the movements of the other with intense suspicion. Each state needed allies, and in 1882, Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy signed a triple alliance, promising to give each other military support in case of war. Then, in the 1890s, Russia and France signed an agreement to protect one another in the event of a war against Germany. By the turn of the century, Kaiser Wilhelm II's provocative nationalistic speeches and naval expansion pushed Britain into closer ties with France. In 1904, Britain and France agreed an entente cordiale, or friendly alliance, which was broadened into a triple entente, embracing Russia, in 1907. The triple entente would become known as the Allied Powers. The atmosphere generated by this international jostling led to an increase in military spending by European governments and the expansion of armies and navies. A spark was all that was needed to ignite the flame of enmity between these two alliances. It came on the 28th of June 1914, when a Bosnian Serb assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, in Sarajevo. The Austrians suspected Serbia, their principal enemy in the Balkans, of the attack. After securing support from its ally Germany, Austria-Hungary presented Serbia with an ultimatum on the 23rd of July, demanding that the Serbs stop all anti-Austria-Hungarian activities. Serbia accepted most of the demands, but Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July. Britain called for international mediation, but the crisis quickly escalated into European war. When Russia mobilized against Austria-Hungary, Germany declared war on Russia on the 1st of August and on France 2 days later. Britain joined the war on the 4th of August after the Germans invaded neutral Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, a small professional troop led by Sir Douglas Haig, had arrived in France by the 22nd of August. It was deployed near the Franco-Belgian border, in line with pre-war military plans agreed with the French government. Germany had to fight a war on two fronts. On the Western Front, in the first weeks of the conflict, the Germans invaded Belgium and France, but their advance was halted by the French and British at the Battle of the Marne. By the end of autumn, the two sides had reached a stalemate. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the fighting remained fluid. Germany dominated, scoring a great victory against the Russians at Tannenberg. But its Austrian allies suffered several defeats. On the Western Front, however, a 645-kilometre, 400-mile trench line stretched from the Belgian coast in the north down through eastern France to the Swiss border. The two sides faced each other across the open space between their front lines. This area, no man's land, had barbed wire fronting the trenches to slow the opposition. Continuous fighting from the trenches, punctuated by appallingly bloody battles, failed to break the deadlock. More than 600,000 Allied troops were killed or wounded in the Battle of the Somme alone. At the start of the conflict, both sides had been convinced it would be a short, decisive battle. No one had anticipated a war of attrition. New mechanized weapons added to the high casualty rates. Tanks were used for the first time, and machine guns such as the German MG-08 Maxim could fire up to 600 bullets a minute. Aircraft, first employed for reconnaissance, were later used for bombing. Both sides used poison gas. Horses were the backbone of logistical operations, but as the war progressed, railways and motor trucks were used to transport goods to the front. Civilians were brought into the front line by the bombing of London and Paris by airships and bomber aircraft. By 1917, German submarines were sinking 1 in 4 merchant ships headed for Britain to try to starve the British into submission. Britain's naval blockade of Germany also led to acute food shortages. This was the first total war, meaning not just soldiers, but also civilian populations were involved. Britain was forced to introduce conscription for the first time in its history. From January 1916, all single men aged 18 to 41 could be called up. Britain and France also assembled armies from their overseas colonies, such as India and Africa, and from the British dominions of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. War brought many social changes, notably for women, who filled positions in factories and offices. Women were also increasingly employed in the munitions industry as governments switched to large-scale production. The key belligerent states brought their vast empires into war with them, and the conflict soon became a world war. German colonies in China and the Pacific were invaded by Japan, which entered the war on the side of the Allies. Germany's colonies in Africa were overrun by British, French, and South African troops. In May 1915, Italy joined the Allies, fighting Austria-Hungary and Germany in the Alps. In early November 1914, the Ottoman Empire, an Islamic power, abandoned its neutrality and declared a military jihad, holy war, against France, Russia, and Britain. The US was drawn into the war by German submarine attacks on commercial ships at sea, such as the one on British liner Lusitania in 1915, with 128 Americans on board. After a German plot to persuade Mexico into an anti-US alliance was discovered, Congress declared war in April 1917. When the Bolsheviks in Russia negotiated a peace treaty with Germany at Brest-Litovsk on the 22nd of December 1917, it seemed Germany had won a significant victory. They also made gains on the Western Front in 1918. But then, in July and August, the Allies counterattacked, beginning an advance that would continue until November. 4 million fresh US troops helped defeat the Central Powers and bring the Germans to the peace table. When the conflict ended, at 11 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, the alliance led by France and Britain emerged victorious. More than 65 million troops had been involved in the war, of which at least half were killed or injured. The Russian, Austrian, and German empires had collapsed. After the war, the Treaty of Versailles redrew the map of Europe, leaving nations, particularly Germany, embittered. A public assembly of countries, the League of Nations, was founded to help maintain peace. However, the League proved toothless in the face of countries that chose to ignore it. When fascist Benito Mussolini came to power in Italy in 1922, he denounced the treaty, In Germany, where the response to the treaty was one of deep resentment, the Nazi Party began to gain momentum. Far from being the war to end all wars, World War I had instead sown the seeds of future conflict.